Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Mini Albums podcast by Zigantala. Hello, my name is Lilith and I am your host today. I'm also the artist behind the mini album series, which you may have seen online. Welcome back to another episode. I've got a huge episode for you guys today, so I'm going to really cut the chit chat because today we've got a Nirvana episode special. So my last couple of episodes that I've done, I've been going into one album per episode, but today we're actually going to be looking into two, and that's going to be Nevermind and In Utero by Nirvana. That's why it's called a special. I don't know if maybe this is going to be a better way to talk about albums, looking at like comparing and contrasting albums rather than looking like deeply into one. And I decided to look into these two albums because I feel like there's two different chapters of Nirvana, you know, their trajectory into the mainstream and then obviously the influx of grunge counterculture, you know, into the mainstream media, and then In Utero being sort of like a counter reaction to all of the commercial success they've received, and then obviously resulting in the tragedy of Kurt Cobain taking his own life. And I would just like to say I'm very sorry for all of the Bleach fans. I couldn't possibly do 3 albums in one episode. That's why I decided not to do Bleach. Please don't come for me. It's a great album. I just do not have the time and capacity to do 3 albums in one. So, yeah, we're going to be looking into those 2 albums. We're going to be looking into what you guys had to say. And I got lots of juicy replies on my Instagram story. So we're going to get into that. And then the topic for today is going to be the price of fame. And that is relating to, obviously, Kurt Cobain taking his life, and we're going to be looking into sort of more the criticisms of fame, how it's basically exploitation, how it's a form of trauma, and how it can ultimately, result in the end or the loss of life. And, you know, there's lots of different things to look into, like, you know, the glamorization of the tortured artist trope, and we're going to be looking into the 27 Club and all things like that. So that's what I've got in tune for you today. Also, by the way, if you're watching the video podcast on YouTube, I hope you like the new setup. I moved, so I can actually now have a nice display on while you watch me, and you don't just have to look at my weird facial expressions. But yeah, I just moved, new place, new energy. So sit tight and we're just going to get into it. We're going to start off with the news segment, music news, which we started last episode, which I sort of regret because it's just something else I had to research. And the news piece I want to discuss is Splendour In The Grass getting cancelled after 10 years of operation. So if you don't know, Splendour In The Grass is like, I would argue, is like the Australian Coachella. It's like one of the biggest festivals in the Australian festival calendar. It's been operating for 10 years now. You know, it's usually the festival where they are booking a lot of international acts. There's lots of international headliners. There was an announcement about a month ago that it's cancelled for reasons that they didn't say. But I think this sort of opens up a bigger conversation because in the last year, music festivals, especially in Australia, have been really battling a lot of issues. And a lot of them have been cancelled as well. So, like, for instance, back in March, there's a festival called Pitch Music and Arts Festival, and that was cancelled in March due to extreme fire warnings and temperatures. In February of this year, we also had Groove in the Moo, which is another regional music festival. It's a travelling music festival as well. That got cancelled. And then last year, Falls Festival, which is a festival that falls over the New Year's, I believe, and I think it's under the same touring company as Splendour In The Grass, also got cancelled. It's just a very interesting time at the moment for festivals because we also had Coachella that happened about 2-3 weeks ago. And even just watching the way that music festival has changed over the last 10 years and where sort of the future of that festival lies as well, I think is a really interesting thing to think about. Because I remember 10 years ago, I remember writing an article about the discontinuation of a lot of travelling festivals in Australia. And that sort of happened around 2013 to 2015. There was lots of festivals that just disappeared off of the face of the Australian festival calendar. So Future Music Festival was one, Big Day Out, Soundwave, Stereosonic. They were all travelling music festivals that would travel to the main capital cities of Australia. So like Perth, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne. And a lot of them died out in sort of the mid 2010s because it just wasn't economically viable anymore. And then there were obviously lots of other things like production costs, not enough ticket sales. A lot of the companies owed a lot of money to the music acts and like didn't end up paying them. And I feel like now, post the pandemic, we are also seeing a lot of sort of complications that are coming with music festivals, like, you know, the cost of living going up, ticket sales are going up. I feel like there's a massive culture shift as well with music festivals. And I feel like it's ultimately having a really big impact on these festivals. For instance, Coachella 2024, we had it about 3 weeks ago. Usually these tickets sell out like easily. And I'm pretty sure it was like the second weekend, they still had tickets available. Like usually Coachella sells out really fast. And apparently Coachella isn't the only festival that's being impacted in America. Another one is the Governor's Ball in New York. You've also got Electric Forest and Lollapalooza. You know, these are festivals that are usually tickets are selling out like within the day of release. But a lot of these festivals aren't really attracting the crowds. And it's interesting just thinking about the fact that maybe music festivals are just not going to be a thing in the future. You know, when you've got inflation, you've got the cost of living crisis, sort of coming from the pandemic, you've got more existential threats like climate change and extreme weather events, which have impacted a lot of festivals in Australia, especially in the last 2-3 years. Another thing that came up a lot in my research is like headlines not being good enough anymore, like festivals not being able to pull in big music acts, which essentially pull in a lot of the crowds to come to these festivals. And looking at the Coachella headlines from the last 2 to 3 years, you know, they had like Bad Bunny, Blackpink, Frank Ocean, Beyonce, Lady Gaga. And these were big headline acts that would pull people in to buying like Coachella tickets. Whereas like now, or even at least the last lineup, I thought the lineup at Coachella was pretty good. But yeah, it seems like they were going through a lot of ticketing issues. They're not selling as fast as they usually are. And I feel like there is this gentrification of music festivals that has happened over the last 10 years. Festivals attracting more of an affluent demographic. So, you know, like influencers, celebrities, music festivals are now attracting more social media attention, and they're sort of shifting away from being a music-centric event to something more of like a massive media event, you know, with lots of publicity and PR, and you've got businesses flocking to these festivals, sending people so they can promote products. There seems to be like lots of emphasis on the coverage of after parties, you know, hosted by massive clothing companies. You know, I think that as well has definitely changed the face of music festivals, and I feel like that would also deter a lot of, you know, music fans and music lovers that would want to come to festivals. It would be a little bit of a turn off knowing that these events have sort of shifted into the realm of being more of like a media event now. And then also another thing is just like festival culture was really big with millennials. And like you can trace it back to sort of like that big sort of burst of indie music, and going to festivals was such a big thing in like the 2010s, and you had the explosion of indie music and, you know, the indie lifestyle and the bohemian sort of clothing trends and all of this cultural appropriation of like bindis and like Indian headdresses. I feel like that was like the golden time of music festivals. And I feel like now that like middle group of millennials that have sort of grown up now are not going to these festivals as much. And now younger people like Gen Zers, I feel like they're not as enticed with sort of this cultural event, you know, and a lot of Gen Zers don't drink as much as millennials do. And obviously money doesn't go as far as it used to. So yeah, I'm wondering whether we're going to see like the death of the music festival in the future. But there is one shining light of hope, and that's Glastonbury, which is a music festival in the UK. So the Glastonbury this year sold out in 22 minutes. And they host around 210,000 people. Coachella pulls about 125,000 people per weekend. So with the 2 weekends together, Glastonbury and Coachella sort of host around the same amount of people. but Glastonbury easily sold out. So I don't know if that had to do with the headline. I don't know if it had to do with the fact that I feel like Glastonbury isn't as glamorized as Coachella. Like, I actually have no idea when this festival is because my feed isn't clogged up with people getting ready to go to this festival. You know, I feel like maybe it is more music centric. And maybe that's also reflected in the fact that their headlines are much more enticing. Who knows? And just as a general like price comparison with tickets, so Glastonbury is £360 for a 5-day pass, and that's including the camping costs. So £360, which equals about $450. And then for Coachella general admission ticket is $550, and you need to pay another $150 if you want to camp. So that comes to a total of $700 just for the camping. That's also a massive difference, $450 compared to $700 for Coachella. A cute little link I found with like this news segment, although I know I started talking about Splendour in the Grass, which is, you know, an Australian festival, but a nice link to sort of what we're talking about today with Nirvana is that the Coachella actually started with a band that came out of the Seattle grunge scene, and that was Pearl Jam. So what happened is Pearl Jam played at the Empire Polo Club in 1993 in the Coachella Valley, and they did that because they wanted to boycott Ticketmaster and all of the venues that were sort of booking through that system. And they hosted this outdoor sort of event, and it attracted about 20,000 people, and that sort of became the blueprint of what would become Coachella. Because I think there was an organizer, I don't know his name, but he sort of was like, okay, like we can actually host music, we can host like a big music event here. And then in the years to follow, Coachella was created. So that's a cute little link I found today. But yeah, let me know what you think about music festivals, because do you think that they're all going to die out? I wonder if they are. To be honest, I am not the biggest music festival fan. I went to Splendour in the Grass in 2015, and I dropped about $1,000 on a weekend where I paid for overpriced alcohol and food. I almost pissed my pants waiting to go to the toilet, and the toilets were diabolical, you know, dealing with crowds, and then also just waking up hungover in a tent with a hole in it. You know, your mattress is deflated and there's a leak in your tent because it's raining outside. There's mud everywhere. Like, I remember like coming home from that weekend and being like, no more festivals. Gigs are good. Gigs in the cities, gigs in Melbourne are great. You know, I can somewhere, I can catch a tram for 10 minutes, I can be at the stadium, be there for a couple of hours, come back, I can use fully functioning toilets, and I can also wake up hungover in my own bed. To me, I've never really been a festival person in the last 10 years. So yeah, maybe they're going to die out. Okay, so news segment closed. Let's go. We're going to be talking about Nevermind and In Utero by Nirvana. I painted both of them on my mini albums denim tote bag for obvious reasons. Nevermind being, you know, I think one of the most famous albums of all time. It is one of the most sold albums of all time as well. But I really want to look into the creative trajectory of the band in regards to these two albums. Obviously, Nevermind being this sort of gateway of, you know, grunge counterculture into the mainstream. We're going to be looking into Kurt Cobain's songwriting, sort of the dynamics of the band, how the album was mixed, and how that sort of influenced the way it was consumed by a global audience. And then I want to look into In Utero as a sort of a counter-creative reaction from the band. I really want to look into the engineer that helped create that album, and that's Steve Albini. I also want to look into, obviously, the lyrics, the creative expression, and like how it sort of differed to Nevermind. I think they definitely went full circle and tried to really embrace like the sound from their first album, Bleach. And yeah, we're going to be looking into, I don't necessarily feel like there needs to be a conversation of what is better. I think it depends on your taste as a person. But I did ask you guys what you thought about it, and we're going to be looking into your opinions as well. So, first album, Nevermind. We're going to look into some quick album info first. So, Nevermind is the sophomore studio album by the band Nirvana, released on September 24th, 1991 by DGC Records. DGC was a division under Interscope Geffen A&M Records, which is a part of the Universal Music Group. In regards to credits, Kurt Cobain is credited mostly as the writer of the songs, and then we obviously have performances by him, Dave Grohl, and Krist Novoselic. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right there. Sorry. The album was mixed and produced by Butch Vig, which is a producer and member of the band Garbage. It was also mixed by Andy Wallace and mastered by Howie Weinberg. Nevermind was Nirvana's first number one charting album. In the week of January the 11th, 1992, Nevermind replaced Michael Jackson's Dangerous. And obviously, it was an unexpected success. The album sold 30 million copies worldwide, solidifying it as one of the best-selling albums of all time. And in regards to the album cover artwork, it was directed by Robert Fisher, who was an in-house creative director of the label, with notable contributions and ideas from Kurt Cobain. So I just want to say one small thing about the artwork. And this is going to take a lot of nuance to understand, which I'm sure a lot of people don't have. I really feel like I just need to create this disclaimer. When I did paint this mini album on my denim tote bag, I specifically and intentionally left out a detail. And this seems to be a detail that a lot of people have realized is not there. And I feel like there's a concerning amount of people that are very hyperfixated on the fact that, like, I didn't paint it, which was the baby's genitals. And that is simply because I am against the mass media distribution of any photo of any minor, regardless of whether it's a music album artwork, regardless of whether people call it art. You know, these types of pictures shouldn't be distributed, especially to the mass degree of like one of the top selling albums of all time. Now, here's the thing. Do I think that Nirvana took this picture intentionally to exploit this child? No. Do I think that Nirvana took this picture to intentionally distribute a picture of a minor? No. I feel like when you look back at the time, and this is where context really matters, back in the 90s, you know, we were not aware of, you know, child exploitation through images. I don't think it's fair to hold the band and the photographer and obviously the guardian that gave consent to this picture. I don't think it's realistic to hold them accountable because it was done in a time where we and they didn't know better. But do I think that the distribution of this image would have a massive psychological impact on the subject that was photographed? 100%. 100%. You think about how embarrassed you are when your mum and dad pull out a picture of you in your bathtub naked in front of your friends. There's like a little tinge of embarrassment when that happens. Can you imagine that done on a global scale? But, you know, the amount of people that are like, oh, this guy should just be grateful, you know, and he like used it to like further his career or to further himself. Like, I feel like unless something like this has happened to you, you really have no say in the way that he's dealing with it. So I just wanted to put that in, and that's why I didn't paint the baby's pee-pee. So, Nevermind. There's two main categories I want to get into today about this album, and that is basically the cultural significance of this album and then the musical significance. Going into the cultural significance of this album, we really need to understand sort of where it came from, and that is the underground grunge scene that happened in Seattle. Now, grunge was a term that was actually coined by a record label called Sub Pop. And Sub Pop was basically an underground label which signed a lot of artists when the grunge scene was sort of starting to, I guess, grow in Seattle, but it wasn't a globally recognized genre or lifestyle. So Sub Pop signed a lot of artists like Nirvana, Mudhoney, and Soundgarden. And this was the label that Nirvana released their debut album with, and that was Bleach. So grunge was essentially something that this label created. It's meant to be like a synonym for dirt, as you would know when you think of the name, you think of like the word grunge. And it was used to describe this music that was really sort of becoming popular. And it was a result of the influences of heavy metal music and punk music. And I would almost argue as well with an influence of pop melody. It was around about, like the late 80s and early 90s. Grunge really started to become a thing. And it wasn't just the music, it was also a lifestyle. You know, it was a philosophy. It wasn't meant to be a fashion statement, but it was a fashion style, you know, the whole combat boot, the flannelette t-shirt, the sort of really grungy, dirty, unwashed sort of rock aesthetic. It was sort of birthed in Seattle because of lots of things like economic hardships were happening at the time. There was a birth of like an anti-establishment movement. In Seattle, there was a big sort of working class culture, and it was a lifestyle and it was an expression from sort of the youth in Seattle, which felt like they had no future prospects. You know, Seattle is quite isolated as well because it's on that northwest coastline in America. It's not like the bustling hub of LA. So grunge was an underground culture that was sort of gaining traction in the late 80s, early 90s. Nirvana released Bleach with Sub Pop in 1989. Then after that, they signed with Geffen Records, and that's the record company that would release Nevermind. And I don't think anyone really fathomed how big it was going to be. And like, it's so fascinating to me looking into, you know, sort of that perfect mess that created, you know, an album that would go on to influence pop culture and influence music as we know it today. Some of the things I've been looking into is just like musically, like how did something that was so, you know, that came from just like one part of the world and just exploded, like what was the appeal? Why? How did that happen? And so there are a couple of things I looked into, and one of them I think is Kurt Cobain's songwriting and his use of melody. Also like the mixing of the album, and we'll get into that later. But looking into like Cobain's songwriting, he really has a talent with melody, and creating perfect melodies for me has been like something I've been fascinated my whole life, you know, and I think there's an art in being able to create something melodically that is of like interest and that like, you know, takes your ear's interest, but simple enough that it gets stuck in your head. And there's like lots of aspects to it when you look into it from a compositional perspective, like rhythm, melodic contour, repetition. But at the end of the day, when it's pop music, it needs to be simple. The simplicity of a melody is like the common denominator that can garner a larger appeal, like a mass appeal. And that's why pop songs, you know, melodies, especially repetition, is just drummed into a lot of pop songs. When you look at the roots of grunge coming from heavy metal and punk, when you look at these two genres already, like melodically, they both have underlying uses of like repetition and rhythm. But what I think grunge did, and especially Kurt Cobain, was really sort of introduced this more melodic contour within this genre of grunge. And I think that's really what captured a larger audience, because it wasn't just this heavy abrasive sound from Seattle. It was also something that you could sing to. The melodies could get stuck in your head. Albums like Nevermind were never really, like, it wasn't a forward-facing pop album. People don't think it's pop, but if you listen to a lot of the melodies, it is. And Kurt Cobain was really good at that. You know, for example, like, one of my favorite songs on Nevermind has always been In Bloom, like since I was like 15. And I've realized now it's because that's probably an example of one of the more melodic songs on Nevermind. Come As You Are. Like, it's such a pretty melody. Being able to fuse together really nice melodies with a really abrasive sound, I think, is one of the appeals that Nevermind sort of projected. Smells Like Teen Spirit as well, like the jumps and leaps in the chorus or even in the verse. Like, Cobain really didn't shy away from like pushing up into like the higher registers and sort of embellishing a lot of his melodies. Like, I think traditionally heavy metal music and punk music never veered towards melody because uh, and this is something that I'm not going to get into, but these forms, these genres really emphasized more on like the timbre of the guitars, you know, distortion and repetition and the energy into it, and in a way that sort of reflected this sort of cultural masculinity. I'm not going to get into that, but I wrote a really interesting essay about that, and I'll get into that when we go into a heavy metal album. But there was more emphasis on repetition and on, yes, simplistic compositional choices. And then I feel like grunge sort of came in, and especially with albums like Nevermind, really sort of introduced these melodies that weren't afraid to like lift up into the high register, that weren't afraid to sort of embellish and jump and create these musical hooks that people would remember, you know. And then when you pair like punk music, I think especially, is quite repetitive, you know, and you pair these more embellished melodies with repetition, that's like a gateway into pop songwriting. So I think that Cobain was really talented with melodies, and there's a good balance of like melody versus more of the heavier stuff on Nevermind. So like, you know, melodies from Come As You Are, Smells Like Teen Spirit, In Bloom, and then you've got other sort of heavier, more repetitive songs like Territorial Pissings, you know, which are less on the melodic side and more on that alternative sort of punk repetition, sort of simplistic compositional element of songwriting. So yeah, I also feel like Nirvana as well were also a very versatile band when it came to dynamics. And I think that's a really big step away from traditional heavy metal and punk music, because heavy metal and punk traditionally quite loud, which Nirvana is, but they also really like to balance out a lot of their compositions with obviously like crazy, heavy wall of sound, but then also whispered verses, you know, very minimal instrumentation. You can see that within songs of Nevermind, and you can see that within the span of the album. You know, there are quieter songs like Come As You Are, and then there are also like crazier, heavier songs, you know, a massive wall of sound songs like Territorial Pissings. So like as a band, I think they definitely sit on a very versatile and dynamic plane. And the thing is that dynamics as well is something that's used to create interest when you look into like movie compositions or like classical music, in Western art music, you know, dynamics were always created to sort of create interest and create tension. And, you know, it was another device that that composers used, because if you just played if you played a piece at the same volume, you know, it's not as impactful as like a piece that's got like a slow build and then it's like big again and it's small. And I guess that's another thing that you could say really helped Nirvana sort of stand out, or even just albums like Nevermind stand out from other sort of grunge albums, because it wasn't just like heavy sound all the time. It was like, you know, again, I hate I hate drawing examples from this song because it's so overdone, but like Smells Like Teen Spirit, intro, crazy wall of sound, introduction, verse, everything gets pulled back. It's just Cobain. And then it just sort of leads up again into the chorus, you know, from the pre-chorus when, you know, more distortion comes in, and then the chorus is more impactful. I think that is definitely a compositional element that was used to sort of garner more interest and like create music and tracks that were a little bit more impactful than songs that just, you know, that just played distortion all the way through with no sort of difference, or like no sort of differing sections. Interestingly enough, talking about dynamics actually leads us perfectly into the way that this album was mixed. The way that this album was mixed is that Butch Vig, who I think was like the main producer that they recorded with, he mixed the tracks, and I think he mixed what he thought was going to be the end result. Then they brought in another music producer called Andy Wallace, and then he created the final mixes that would then be released. There seems to be a little bit of back and forth in regards to like the band not being fully okay with the final mixes. Kurt Cobain seemed to be a little bit outspoken on the fact that he didn't really like how polished and finished, Nevermind sounded compared to like their album before, Bleach. It sounds like it was mixed for radio. And something really interesting and cool I would recommend you to do if you're a Nirvana fan is that there's a super deluxe edition of Nevermind which was released in 2021, and it actually features a whole heap of Devonshire mixes, and these were actually the original mixes that Butch Vig mixed. And so you can actually listen to those mixes, and then you can actually compare them to the Andy Wallace mixes of the actual version that came out. And yeah, I would encourage you to have a listen because it's interesting. When I listen to Nevermind, I'm like, oh wow, like it's heavy music. But then when you look at the difference between what the band, or at least what Butch Vig intended versus what was released, you can definitely see that, or you can definitely hear that the sound was produced a little bit more to be radio friendly. Some of the differences I can hear in like the Devonshire mixes versus the normal mix is that the Devonshire mixes definitely sound more like a live version. There's more overhead frequencies when it comes to the drums, the guitar distortion. There's a lot more reverb. There's less EQ, equalization. As I said, the frequencies aren't really smoothed out as much as the final version. There's also less compression, which is interesting, talking about like Nirvana being a very like versatile band when it comes to dynamics, because compression is really, really important for that sort of stuff. If you don't know, like a basic sort of explanation of compression is like a tool that has been used in audio recording to lessen the distance between like the loudest point in a song and the quietest point. And basically what compression does is it sort of squishes a sound frequency down so that when you play it on something like a radio, like the sound doesn't clip and like distort because it hits like its maximum volume, and when you play it on the radio, that's when you hear clipping. Or when you play like loud songs on your phone and your speakers clip, like compression is used so that doesn't happen. It's also used to make sure that when you do listen to songs like on the radio and there are varying like parts of the song that are quiet and loud, you don't have to say turn the radio up when it becomes quiet because you can't hear it, but then turn it down when the loud part starts. There's just less of an extreme in the dynamics. It pushes it, it sandwiches it down a little bit more so it can be easily more consumable through, radio. And I think that's sort of where the criticisms come from Cobain or whoever. I don't know. I read as well that there was no dispute. Like the band actually signed off on the final mixes by Andy Wallace and they were fine with it. But the Devonshire mixes definitely exude more of like that DIY punk record feel. There's more sound of the space and there's more like spikes. Like you can really sort of hear a lot of the higher frequencies come through, especially with like the hi-hats and like the distortion. But I think there's also the Devonshire mixes definitely don't have that same sort of pop feel, because there are songs like Territorial Pissings, for example, where Cobain's vocals aren't really getting through the mix. And like for a punk record, that would probably be fine and a stylistic choice, but then for music that you would want to be played on the radio, you would really want that vocal to be pushed forward, because that's pop music and that's what radio was created for, So yeah, it's interesting to sort of look into those stylistic choices and those creative decisions in regards to how Nevermind was essentially executed and produced. And one thing I really want to get into as well is just how, like, obviously the album was released, it was massive, and it marked this influx of the grunge counterculture into mainstream music. And one thing I really want to talk about as well is just how Nirvana were able to redefine and ultimately reject the traditional rock musician archetype. Because if you look at like the 80s, you know, that time before grunge became a thing, you know, this whole image of a rock musician was very extroverted, it was very loud, it was very hyper masculine, you know, and it perpetuated a very hyper masculine space, or an exclusively masculine space. And so basically what I think happened is, like, when Nirvana came onto the scene, who this band was and like the personality they exuded was something that completely defied what we sort of saw rock musicians as. You know, there was obviously this rejection of mainstream ideas. There was this backing of anti-establishment from the grunge scene. There was more of this DIY, low income, empathetic, pro-feminism, you know, non-homophobic ideology that came with this band. So yeah, I think that Nirvana really showed a different, sort of a more deeper, angstier side to like the rock musician archetype in regards to their personality, also in regards to like their song content and obviously their sound as well. But I feel like that's also a massive cultural impact that this band had at the time. You know, a lot of the themes of the songs in Nevermind and in Utero, which we'll get into, you know, offer this angsty insight. You know, there's lots of existentialism, there's lots of uncertainty, there's lots of pro-feminist references. You know, I know that Kurt Cobain was also pro-gay rights. I feel like they presented this much more empathetic yet still apathetic side to music and created this new image for a rock musician. And I think that helped to popularize grunge music and sort of that counterculture that came with it. It is just a very different reaction to, yeah, you know, these very extroverted rock stars, this very hyper masculine space that was rock music. And now it was sort of being shattered by, you know, these three boys that, you know, that played music that would sound like you would hear it in like some garage somewhere, that would talk about, you know, just depressive or angsty lyrics. Like, it's just absolutely fascinating just researching about this and knowing like, yeah, the cultural impact and like, you know, the ideas that revolved around, you know, the grunge lifestyle. And yeah, pretty cool. So that's Nevermind. That concludes part 1 of the Nirvana Special, and you can continue by clicking onto the next podcast episode or video on YouTube to proceed to part 2.